Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are really pleased to welcome you all to this last hearing, at least of this week, this public hearing on the Just Transition Mechanism. My name is Annabella Rosenberg. I work for the Climate Action Network International. And on behalf of all the organizing committee made of the APMDD, so the Asian People's Movement Against it and for Development, but also the Women and Gender constituency and the Youth constituency at the UNFCCC. We are really happy to have with us our experts and members of the panel to engage in this event to help us reflect about the future of the BAM, the now called Belém Antalya mechanism for just transition, and also in the negotiations called the Just Transition Mechanism. We have been working as civil society quite intensively on just transition at global climate conferences to ensure that, or at least try to ensure that all the aspects of climate action embrace the need for securing justice for workers, for indigenous peoples, for communities, and also support all countries in their efforts to find the pathways for their people's prosperity and dignity. COP30 constituted a major landmark for advancing justice, equity, and rights through just transition. A decision was made there outlining key principles that must be taken into account when advancing just transition. And on top of that, and quite key to civil society demands, governments committed to develop for decision this year in 2026 a just transition mechanism that will make all those principles, or should make all those principles, become real on the ground. Our groups outlined many demands on the mechanism, which, as I said, we have called the BAM. And as we prepare for the next round of negotiations, we wanted to hear from experts, from practitioners that go well beyond our usual constituencies and groups, and get their thoughts on how we can make the just transition mechanism work, how we learn from past experiences, how it can accelerate the good work that is happening on the ground. Instead of having those conversations privately, we decided to hold them out there in the air and for the benefit of a much larger audience. And in this session that is about to start, we are extremely happy to have with us Jodi and Wang and Lian Orme from the Just Transition Finance Lab. We are going to hear from them a presentation that then will be followed by an interactive exchange with representatives from civil society. And in this session, we are going to have Amani Darkawi and Camila Mercury asking also questions on the civil society side. I would like just to introduce in a few words Jodi and Liam. Jodi and Wang, who has been part of the Grants and Research Institute at LSE, and she has been leading the lab, the lab that they have on just transition finance on the Global Policy Work Program. And she's been engaging with policy audiences in the public and private sectors, in particular on international just transition relevant fora. She has advised governments, financial institutions on regulatory reforms, also as a climate policy specialist on the UN principles for responsible investments. And she has contributed and cooperating with the Yungo constituency in the UNFCCC and also very many other climate spaces. Jodi is also a PhD candidate and working hard on that these days in international development at the Uni of Oxford. We are also really happy to have with us Liam Orme, who's the Policy Fellow at the Just Transition Finance Lab. And Liam's work focuses on the political economy of finance, digital infrastructure, and state capacity in the context of the net zero transition. He's been co-authoring research at the lab on MDBs, multilateral development banks, how they use bonds to fund just transitions. He has served also as a research consultant to the World Bank, UNDP, and the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And he's been also working for several years on the provincial clean energy policy in British Columbia, Canada. So friends, Jodi and Liam, we are really, really happy to have you, to hear your thoughts generally on the work you've been doing on just transition finance and also how this intersects with a potential global mechanism. So the floor is all yours. Looking forward.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really great to be here. And while I get set up, let me just say I think this is a wonderful initiative, and I really admire the effort to make this open as a form of dialogue and sort of participatory effort as we all make sense of this opportunity. So really excited to be here today and honored to have the invitation, and excited to be here with Jodi as well. So can you all see the slides that I'm sharing? Good.
Very well.
Great. Okay, so who are we? The Just Transition Finance Lab was launched in February 2024. We're hosted at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. And our aim is to support the transformation of the global financial system to achieve progress on climate and nature goals through a people-centered approach. And we have four interlocking objectives to this end. We will focus on financial instruments, metrics, policy, and case studies. And as a center for experimentation and excellence, we see how these elements work together, which is why we focus on all of them together. So today we want to share a little bit of some insights from our work that we're using to inform our thinking on the challenges and opportunities for just transition mechanism within the UNFCCC. And, at a basic level to start, we recognize that parties face a complex and shifting landscape when mobilizing finance for just transitions. And we want to think about what the mechanism can offer in response to that across three different levels. At a system level, we believe a just transition mechanism could help parties confront the headwinds that arise from structural challenges that are deeply embedded. At a national level, or at level between nations too, we think a just transition mechanism could help parties address layered coordination challenges within and beyond their borders. And at an institutional level, we believe the just transition mechanism can help parties identify options and consider trade-offs. So we want to go into each of those in a little bit more depth in our presentation today. I'll hand it off to Jodi to talk about the system and structural level.
Thank you, Liam. So going from the grand to the granular, I want to tell a little bit about our latest thinking on the systems aspect of just transition finance, what's constraining it, and what are the symptoms of these constraints, and what we ought to do about them. So this is from a report that we published in October of last year, which we also had Annabella join us to share perspectives on the BAM during the presentation, but I will flip that diagnosis upside down. In the report, we first look at the latest trends and issues facing just transition finance, and then attribute them to more systemic causes within the global financial system, and how perhaps the existing financial logic is not yet compatible with a just transition outcome. But here we will go from the structural challenges first, and then look at how they're manifesting in terms of looking at climate politics on a more granular basis. We found 5 different structural challenges that are currently constraining not only the flow of just transition finance, but how the financial system operates, what its core logic is, and how that is incompatible with perhaps the just transition outcomes that we want to see. The first one is around power, how just transition is not yet part and parcel or hardwired into the political economy of today. And so justice remains an additive element to economic policymaking, to political policymaking, as opposed to being kind of the core policy plank in that process. The second is around boundaries. Just transition has been often conceptualized as a national phenomenon, rightfully so. There's a lot that we need to pay attention to at the national level, or even more granular at the subnational level, because context is extremely important in the just transition. That being said, something that we have observing in an increasingly interconnected world is how one place's transition to net zero low carbon development often displaces harms, often displaces injustices to elsewhere, to other locations in the world. And this harm shifting often happens along global value chains. Particularly salient is in the extractive economies. So we need a better framing of just transition that accounts for this existing territorialized framing of justice, and something that accounts for the interconnectedness and interdependence of the just transition agenda. Because if it's not global, it's not just, which I'm quoting from a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty report that came out last year around financing. The third thing is around the way that we are still looking at solving just transition through finance via very strong market first logic, and that it's oftentimes irreconcilable, because the way that the market logic tends to flow towards bankable projects, and this is linking to the architecture bias as well, flowing towards bankable contexts and contexts where return is guaranteed, while displacing and perhaps obviating some of the more acute needs of vulnerable communities that do not have bankability on the just transition related projects, but are providing very strong justice frameworks and outcomes and impacts at a subnational and context specific level, and those cannot be accounted for in a very strong market based logic. And the last thing is around complexity. I think we, as an ecosystem of thinking about just transition while acknowledging the context specificity of just transition, tend to look for universal solutions and silver bullets, when actually that can mask the very complexity of the just transition agenda and turn it into a tick box exercise. So these are the structural elements. And what is it that is manifesting more acutely than as headwinds? I won't go into this in detail, but we diagnosed 4 of them. The first around political legitimacy crisis, the short-term policy cycle of domestic policies versus the long-term patient capital and long-term political agenda that is needed for the just transition, which can make investments quite uncertain. The second is around the eroding fiscal foundations. We're looking at a retreat of grant and concessional-based finance, which then shifts towards a heavier reliance on private capital and different blending and de-risking models. These then subordinate just transition goals within market imperatives, which then subjects just transition to as a condition on profitability, as opposed to a form of common public good. The third thing is around government's fragmentation. Within the global financial architecture and the just transition finance ecosystem, there's a lot of different reporting needs, high costs in terms of transactions, and different access requirements and reporting burdens on vulnerable communities. And those can lead to finance flowing to those who are most equipped to deal with this government's fragmentation, and not those who need the money the most. And the last thing is on transparency. Transparency can be seen as an accountability tool, but oftentimes now within the transparency regimes within the financial system, disclosures are often used to serve investors' information needs to make decisions on corporate investment, as opposed to utilizing that data for broader social good, which can be very, very valuable for both the just transition agenda, but also the mechanism in particular. So how do we link these headwinds then back to the BAM that we're talking about here? And where do we see these various diagnoses being kind of resolved through the BAM? We don't necessarily see the BAM solving all of the just transition finance issues that I've outlined, and I think that is a fair and prudent judgment to make. Particularly when we're thinking about the massive scale of transforming the financial system that we need. But we do see the BAM as a very useful mechanism and tool to think about solving the headwinds. In terms of the political legitimacy crisis, having cross-border collaboration and the long-term agenda to think through the just transition policy needs beyond short-term policy cycle is extremely important. And when it comes to the the lethargy in financing and actually mobilizing finance, the mechanism can be a place to kind of share strategies and needs and facilitate finance support, almost like a matchmaking system of a central control tower, however metaphor you want to use it. And the governance fragmentation can be mended through both at a party level and more sharing experiences at a place-based level, collaboration to kind of share expertise and knowledge around making the governance process more consistent and more catered towards vulnerable communities' needs. And last thing around transparency is that it can both elevate the importance of transparency connected to existing UNFCCC processes, but also use data and use the information that we have for good through a centralization process. And with that, I'll pass down to Liam to kind of take us to the next granular level around national level challenges.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jodi. So focusing on the second level then, within and around the scale of nations embedded within that systemic level that Jodi discussed. The lab has conducted some analysis of recent initiatives, including the JET-Ps, and identified a layered coordination needs between plans, projects, and financing over time that these initiatives face. Specifically, in looking at the grants, allocations and disbursements under JET-Ps as a signal of progress in implementing that overarching vision, and the financing arrangements that support it. We found that grants are a relatively small share of the overall JET-P commitment, and relatively and somewhat predictably, perhaps front-loaded in the delivery cycle. Within South Africa, 70 million or 10% of the total amount dedicated to grants went to just transition themed activities. Within Indonesia, 25 million or dollars or 15% of the total grant envelope went to just transition related activities. And these grants, from our analysis, were driven more by donor interest than domestic budgets and capacities. And they did offer support, but often that support created time-bound institutional capacity, which results in cliff effects, where once that time limit is reached, there's a challenge of translating that into an ongoing institutionalized initiative. And so this points to one finding overall, which is that the absence of a clear organizing framework for grants results in a bias towards activities that are easy to initiate but difficult to institutionalize, which pulls you away from an integrated and cohesive long-term plan that can translate between a relatively scarce pool of grants to promised forms of finance and other mechanisms like loans or concession finance. This research was geared at producing recommendations for the next generation of JET-Ps, which are, in the form of country platforms. To highlight some of those findings and recommendations specifically before translating into the mechanism, which is our topic today, we see a variety of roles for grants, and these are not without their trade-offs and challenges. We see a need to prioritize co-design for economic transformation with national and local partners to mitigate against short-termism, isolated projects, or reflecting interests from outside the domain of country ownership. We see an opportunity to connect disbursements with observable milestones so that you can monitor and build momentum over the delivery timeline. And we see a need to identify and support cross-border initiatives where this could lower costs in both jurisdictions or support other shared priorities. And in order to do this effectively, we need to leverage different institutions and different purposes. So national development banks and multilateral development banks are worth our consideration here, where they're present. Translating those recommendations into the domain of this just transition mechanism, these existing initiatives hold valuable lessons as a starting point. because they aim to connect donors and recipients, because they aim to respond to context and specific opportunities and needs. And there are a bunch of initiatives proceeding in parallel. There's a growing number of country platforms being announced, and there's a coordinating infrastructure, such as the country platform hub that's been announced alongside that. And there's an opportunity, we think, for the Just Transition mechanism to leverage and align and support activities through initiatives like those. And then we also see a really important need out of this for technical advice to be adapted to existing institutions, stakeholder interests, and local contexts, and that capacity building and information sharing support can build that planning function that is needed to coordinate between types and sources of finance. And so this level, of course, is not distinct from or separated from the level that Jodi is talking about, system level. These challenges that are primarily around coordination also are connected and relevant to those headwinds and structural constraints that she covered. At an institutional level, the lab has been focusing on identifying emerging best practices across a range of actors engaging in just transition finance. We focused on multilateral development banks. And this starts from a recognition that there's a choice when seeking to advance just transition finance to either embed just transition as a priority in existing activities and instruments, or to develop novel approaches. So our work on emerging best practices aims to identify lessons for issuers and recipients of financing from emerging activities in different areas of the financial system. We focus on MDBs, multilateral development banks, because they have made existing high-level commitments to just transition finance. They have a high level of influence, and they are undertaking diverse initiatives to operationalize their commitments. What are they doing? They are developing organizational strategies. The ADB has developed regional and sectoral pilots. For another example, the Africa Development Bank has developed a theory of change around just transition. They're developing operational tools like taxonomies, ESS policies, and others. And they're raising finance through bespoke financing mechanisms like Amazonia bond frameworks, and they're using trust funds and other pools of grants and financing that they have access to. And they're also engaging in technical advice and project preparation support. Looking at MDB's use of GSS bonds, we see them adapting. We see that adapting high-level just transition commitments into more day-to-day operating routines of an organization is a really complex challenge. We see that MDBs recognize the importance of ensuring a social license for successful climate action, and that they recognize just transition finance needs to reflect context and transition priorities. This also has insights for others interested in GSS bonds. I'll say just quickly for issuers, this is Just Transition offers a holistic framing for their bond issuances and frameworks. And for investors, it allows a lens for assessing impact that goes beyond existing practices. And investors can look at GSS bond framework, second-party opinions, but most importantly, they should look at the issuer's context and institutional strategies to assess alignment with the just transition. So that gets pretty technical, but there are a couple insights for the just transition mechanism as we think at a basic level, and this is repeated across the different levels today, there's perhaps no standard playbook for just transitions. And so it can be challenging to balance a principled approach to just transitions with the need for adapting to context. But we think that focusing on just processes offers one strategy through that tension. So I'll hand it back to Jodi for synthesis and conclusions, and then we look forward to chatting with you.
I think when we think about the various aspects of how finance fits into the just transition agenda and how just transition is part of the broader climate agenda, we do see cascading effects on how one levers pulls on the other. And then so in an era where I think all policies are in a way climate policies, and all policies have implications for the climate agenda, just transition is really the hinge for accountability, the hinge for ambition, and the hinge for making things happen. And finance within that, in both just transition and the broader climate aspect, is the glue that holds that system together. It has caused a lot of grievance in terms of party negotiations, but it's also very systematically evident of how we think about the issues and the solutions that we deploy as well. So we do hope to see the BAM working through cutting across these different system, national and institutional levels to help identify options and opportunities, become a coordination mechanism that helps facilitate and ease some of the existing tensions and bottlenecks in financing just transitions, and help eventually to not only think about the headwinds that are emerging in the just transition finance agenda, but think about the financial system transformation as a whole as well. And with that, we'll stop there.
Wow, this is great. We couldn't expect less from you folks. I think thank you so much also for all the time you dedicated to this presentation, to really think so deeply into what the mechanism could do to address what is indeed a really good report that I encourage everyone to read, like the report on headwinds that Jodi and Liam were referring to, produced by the Just Transition Finance Lab. I'm sure Camila, Manny have a lot of questions. I do have a couple, and I would just share them, go through a quick round, and then pass the ball back to you. I mean, one is more of an observation, and I wonder what your thoughts were about something that we've been observing, which is there seems to be quite some space and openness from governments to discuss at the policy level what the convergence space on just transition could look like. So we've seen, I mean, like the decision we got last year at the COP on a principles and definitions level is pretty solid, but also there have been other spaces like in the ILO, including in the banks, as you were saying. I mean, countries have been producing quite a bit of policy guidance on just transition. So a certain level of multilateral decision making. However, the financing of just transition remains extremely driven by donors, with hardly any space for multilateral decision making. And I wonder, yeah, we would like to see the mechanism playing a role in multilateralizing the financing decision element of it. But yeah, I would welcome your thoughts on that. And the other one is actually on the role of the banks that you were referring to. There is a clear tension here between the fact that they are doing just transition or self-defined just transition work. We have now, I think, a pretty strong corpus of principles and ideas agreed at the COP. We have a mechanism that we want to see emerging this year. And there is a lot of tension, including across civil society, about what do we do with these actors that are not in the family, but they are also having an impact on what's happening on the ground on just transition. Yesterday, we had the Bretton Woods Project sharing their thoughts about how we should not be engaging with them somehow. But I welcome also your thoughts in the spirit of this open conversation to inform our decisions on what to do with these actors, what we should be expecting from them in the context of this mechanism. Pass it to Camila and Amani for their questions.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really appreciate the systemic framing of the just transition mechanism, especially the points about markets, power, and complexity, and also the articulation between the different levels. So I have one question. In your opinion, how could the BAM or the just transition mechanism help identify or prevent or unprevent false solutions? I mean, projects that are labeled as transition or climate actions that actually harm territories, communities. Yes, I'm wondering what's your opinion about that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cami. Amani.
Thank you so much. This was quite insightful, and I really liked how it was structured into the structural challenges, national, and then institutional level. I have many, many questions, but I will start with the burning ones. I think one thing came into my mind, like seeing this structure, I think, do you see the just transition finance in this setup being probably primarily as project-based intervention, which I think has been done with the JBs and in many occasions till today, or it should be economy-wide support linked to, just like you mentioned, national development strategies, NDCs, or maybe even other national plans. So do you see it more being a framework for this project-based intervention, or harder, it would be an economy-wide kind of support or framework that we would be looking for, like more global, very more national and embedded in the economic system of parties, which obviously would be harder to do, but probably with the structure you gave would make more sense. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Amani. Jodi, all yours.
Maybe I can start, and I'll address what Amani just provoked first, which I think is an excellent provocation, and then go to Camilla and maybe let Liam talk about the MDB's role here. In the way that the Headwinds and Structural Constraints paper framed it, the just transition finance is referring to the type of climate finance flows that are doing multiple things at once. It's shifting economies away from carbon intensive systems that are built on extractive industries. It's looking at redistributing power and resources, and is looking at protecting community sovereignty over their own development pathways. So while the financing lands at the project level, I think the propensity of just transition finance, when framed in this way, is thinking about the way that we conceptualize the political economy and what it ought to do. Right. So, and I think thinking about the structural constraints is extremely important, because it's not only about how finance delivers justice, but also actually like what kind of financial logic serves what kind of justice means, right? So it's not just about moving money from point A to point B. While we need to do that, I think there's a broader consideration that we have to have. So I think in the context of the BAM, and of course in thinking about the just transition in real time, of course they will go to projects. Of course that is what's happening here. But the way that the finance is distributed, how it's and what kind of money is being distributed, and what terms, then ultimately shift an economy. It becomes an economy-wide intervention. Is how I would like to think about this. And then Camila, on the BAM, or thinking about just transition finance in this way, so the BAM can help identify or prevent false solutions and projects that harm communities. And this is precisely the reason why we need to think about that second pillar in the structural constraints, which is the interconnectedness of the justice agenda. I think hopefully through the BAM, which is multilateralizing the just transition, we can start mapping, diagnosing, or at least acknowledging, identifying the fact that one place's just transition has unjust implications elsewhere. And we can think about that via a scalar way, whether that is through kind of better project data, whether that's through kind of influencing better negotiating power on just transition projects. I think that that's a way to kind of bring to light some of the existing inequalities that are hidden beneath the surface when we're talking about the just transition. I think full-on prevention will always be, I think, a difficult task, but at least we need to start acknowledging the fact that there are cross-border knock-on effects that are currently not addressed in this space.
Yeah, these are great questions. I had to note them down. I have a few ideas that I want to share, building on what Jodi said, and maybe end up addressing your question, Annabella, about MDBs and different actors and their roles. For me, this starts addressing these three different questions kind of has a common starting point, or two common starting points. The first is to recognize that just transition pathways are highly contextual, place-based, They leverage or respond to specific institutional arrangements and capacities, existing and potential partnerships. The second starting point is that we're hearing that we're heading into an era where donor countries view their geopolitical strategy as building, quote, variable geometries, different partnerships for different purposes. And so I think a mechanism needs to respond to that. And I think it could be a focal point for parties to navigate these complexities present in those two different starting points, to identify trade-offs and find shared interests and support. And that's not just matching donors and recipients, that can also be identifying areas of shared interest between uh, countries that are receiving finance, because that could improve their position in conversations with donors. And so accelerating just transitions is perhaps about finding and scaling those shared interests and about creating spaces that can do that. And for this, I think the mechanism needs some centralized convening power, some coordinating and support capacity. Yeah, and we're continuing to, as we develop our own submission to the process, we're looking back at some of the existing models and mechanisms within the UNFCCC to see what illustrative or cautionary lessons they offer. And so I think addressing some of your questions more specifically, I agree with what Jodi is saying about the value of an economy-wide scope and the planning and system level view in advance of thinking about the role of specific projects or financing arrangements. And I think just to add in the different levels illustrate some of the challenges of risk mitigation. So you can recognize, if you focus too much on the coordination challenges, you might inadvertently entrench some of the structural challenges, or get blown around by the headwinds and find yourself facing less than ideal options a few years down the line. So it's important to have these different levels in mind. And maybe to your question, Annabella, it's a tough one, but I think the goal should be to preserve and expand the set of options that are available. And to share insights on when support from MDBs were a good fit for certain purposes, when countries got creative with their interpretation of the options that were available, and how they navigated that process. And I've been very interested in cases where countries have used different forms of industrial policy or power procurement or feed-in tariffs to avoid having to resort to sort of broad loan guarantees, or to access pools of domestic or regional finance that before might not have been at the table. I'm thinking about the case of Vietnam, for example, there.
Thanks so much. Thanks for all these thoughts. A lot in there. Mindful of the hour. Maybe just a generic question that we've been asking everyone is also, how do you see, in this case, the Just Transition Finance Lab contributing to the mechanism? What do we see as your role, and which kind of setup would allow you to contribute? I wonder also if Camille or Amani have other questions, so that we do a final second round and then pass the ball back. You are fine, Camille? Good. Amani?
I did have a following question, but if it's going to be more details, then it's okay. But I'm going to ask it anyway in
Go for
case
it.
we
Go
have
for
a
it.
few minutes. Okay, thank you. Just a follow-up question on the NDBs. I think we had amazing conversation, and I think yesterday we had an amazing conversation about IFIs and in the role of NDBs, etc. And we were informed, and it has been shared with us that in a lot of cases, these NDBs serves the donor country's policy and priorities. And I think my question is, because we are justice centered, would it make sense to have, I don't know, a third party or sort of conditionality back to these MDBs to try to center justice instead of making sure that the investors, either institutional or private, get their own returns? Because in a lot of times, these MDBs make a lot of structural adjustment or policy recommendation or just conditionality to make sure that the investors will get their own returns on investment instead of that these, let's say, global south countries will get back on foot and do well economically speaking and socially speaking. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Over to you, folks, on this, and also like any further thought that you think would be worth us thinking about as we build up our positions on the BAM.
I think I can start with what the lab can do. I think the lab is trying to hold together something that perhaps in these negotiation spaces is hard to hold together, which is, a separate track for finance and a separate track for just transition and a separate track for all the different other elements. And we're trying to bring it together in a way that I think in a way that makes it cohesive why these different agendas are interlinked, and also make it cohesive in a way that there is the just element. Like if you take apart each of the words of the lab, they each mean something. Just transition finance lab. So, and the emphasis on the lab about kind of experimenting and trying to understand. But I also think we've had a very, since the inception of the lab and even before, we've produced a lot of case studies on just transition finance, and from interacting with policy stakeholders especially, we see a lot that if you show us how it's been done elsewhere and the lessons learned, then we can take bits and pieces of it and adapt it to our own context. So in that way, I think we need a lot more evidencing, but also fully aware of the fact that there's a lot of case studies being produced on the just transition and just transition finance. So if the BAM can also be a way to kind of centralize some of this as a knowledge hub, I think that could be extremely helpful as well. But in the meantime, we're working across different geographies, we're working at different scales with different actors to kind of bring this agenda together. Because yes, there has been historical harm perpetuated by a lot of the actors in the finance space and the financial system against the just transition. But now that just transition has also become a hot topic where it's easier to eschew the words than it is to do the thing. I think coming together and actually holding different layers of accountability is also incredibly important, because otherwise we can't risk having the just transition as kind of a vehicle of appropriation as well, because it's much easier said than done.
Well said. Liam?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a stab at your question, Amani, as we wrap up. Yeah, I think it's a really challenging question. And I think part of the difficulty in answering it and addressing it in a satisfying way is that there is a whole system of actors there who do have incredible capacity. I mean, incredible in terms of just like scale. It's not always amazing. It's important to critique. And I think it's also important to keep pushing and learning and understanding how they adopt slightly different approaches and why that matters, because that might have some insight into when to lean in, when to step back, and how to engage in the ongoing shaping of those institutions to fulfill a productive purpose for the public value and public good. And because they are actively engaging, their engagement on just transitions is not static, but it's not perfect, and so yeah, our efforts have been to try and understand that as a dynamic process and the opportunities that come with that, but also, and this is why we use that word very deliberately, like there are big trade-offs. And so I look forward to continuing to learn more about those together. So I'd love to pick up that conversation from today.
Thanks so much, Liam. And there's so much in there, and I'm sure people would really benefit also from getting the presentation. So don't hesitate to send it our way so that we can distribute it also beyond in the different communities. I think there is always, this issue that sticks to me in your presentations, and this idea that the kind of finance determines the kind of just transition that we are going to have. And I think more granularity on those kinds of finance for the different aspects of just transition, I think we need to somehow get there. Also to inform a better conversation in what Jodi was saying. It's a very difficult discussion in the context of the UNFCCC, where there is the climate finance conversation, the just transition conversation, and we tend to, take it all together. It seems almost impossible. But I think bringing also new ways of engaging in this discussion, and in particular the qualitative aspect of the kind of finance that is needed for different parts. Because yes, as you were saying, Liam, there might be elements that the banks can offer that could be helpful for some parts of those national strategies funding, but not all. And which are the ones that these vehicles will not fit? So can we try to disaggregate that a bit more as we advance in this conversation about the quality of climate finance, and not only the millions or billions that are needed, which is probably one of those places that takes most of the political attention in the negotiation. But I think that's certainly going to be part of the continuation of this conversation with you folks. In the meantime, and mindful of the hour, I think just thanking you for coming in, for always bringing new insights, new work, new numbers, new categories, new proposals. I think it's always great. They challenge us, and I'm sure it's going to help us further define our demands towards the mechanism. And looking forward for more exchanges with you. Also, massive thanks to Camila, to Amani for joining us, to Francesca, who was there in the background helping us in the backstage, and maybe using a minute in this last hearing also to thank to all the panelists and experts that have been joining us for this whole week. It has been a huge privilege to be on this side, getting all this information, insights, questions, content, and I hope we do justice to all this effort that everyone has made as we prepare for the next round of negotiations and trying to get the best possible BAM out there. So